So first, thanks for your flexibility on Tuesday. Sorry for that schedule change. I hope the recorded lecture was useful. Are there any questions? Well, first I'll go over, so standard announcements, muddiest point this Sunday, concept check 2 on unit 2, which we'll be done with on Tuesday with immunocomputing. That is we do next Sunday, unless immunocomputing for some reason takes longer. And mini project 1 on a kind of basic GA is due this Sunday. And that is the only mini project which is not eligible to be dropped. So before we move on, are there any questions or lingering questions anybody wanted to bring up about Tuesday's lecture about the CMA-ES or anything having to do with announcements coming up? If anything does come up, of course, put in the muddiest point. Happy to respond there. That's kind of like asynchronous office hours. I do have office hours Mondays at 4 p.m. So if you're looking for those and missed that, those are available too. Or just feel free to send me a note, Slack message, Slack DM, or an email, or something on Canvas, a Canvas message. If you have any questions that come up about these things and you want to bring up in class, feel free to do that. Otherwise, so moving forward, how do we pivot off of what we just talked about into evolutionary computing and genetic programming? And I'm going to start here with talking about, and this has come up, questions about, like you might be familiar with gradient descent. You've heard about it used in a number of applications. You may not have been as familiar with some of these meta heuristics. So when do you use them? And these just historical things that we're talking about, or is there actually application where it makes sense to use those over these other things? And so I'm going to talk about that, and that's going to help us transition into one of these applications where you certainly can use gradient descent for, which is genetic programming and evolutionary programming. Okay, so as a reminder, just because I'm going to refer a little bit, just to have it available as a foil, as a comparison. Stochastic gradient descent, which isn't really a topic from this class, but just as a reminder, is this idea that you have an optimization that minimizes a loss function by following an available gradient of that loss function. And so if you could take the gradient of this loss function, you can use that to tell you what direction to step in. So we've talked about step sizes with CMA-ES or with ES in general. And so you can imagine if you have one step size, so you're in your decision space and you want to decide where to take a step, then you can calculate the derivative of your loss function with respect to every possible pure step direction. And you're going to find that some directions have higher derivatives than others. There's higher rates of change in some directions than others. You bundle all of those things together into what's called the gradient, and it tells you the direction of steepest ascent or descent. And that tells you that if you want to minimize, you walk in the negative, so if the steepest ascent is going up, you walk the opposite direction. If you want to go up, you walk in that direction. So that's the idea behind gradient descent if you're minimizing, or gradient ascent if you're maximizing. And the stochastic part comes into play in these cases like neural networks. The loss function that you've constructed to minimize is actually going to be based on training data. And so you've got a bunch of training examples, and those examples have, for a given input, a desired output. So for every example, you can calculate a so-called loss. That's this loss I here. So this theta, these are your decision space. So those are, in the case of a neural network, the weights of a neural network. And so this is saying that what's the loss, the difference between input and predicted output relative to expected output. So this loss function will often just be a difference. So it might be, I expected you to predict a cat. Instead, you predicted a dog. I have some way to measure, there's a metric difference between cat and dog, and I use that to penalize you for giving me the wrong answer or to reward you for giving me the right answer. And the stochastic part is you create these so-called mini batches where I might have given you 1,000 or 1,000,000 training examples, And so you choose a subset of them every time you calculate the gradient. So every epoch that you go through to say, I'm going to calculate the gradient, figure a direction. The next time you do figure a direction, you choose a different subset. So you choose, similar to choosing the number of parents in a GA, you choose the number of training examples you use to calculate that gradient. And it's going to be smaller than the full set. And that sampling, choosing different ones every time, choosing a smaller number than the total, it gives you an unbiased, so a zero bias estimate of the gradient that has noise that's added. So if you use all of your data, there's no noise. You get sort of the best, the cleanest estimate of the gradient. But as you use less and less of that data, taking different random points every time, then you get more noise in your gradient direction. So truly uphill might be there, but when you calculate the gradient one time in the algorithm, it might give you slightly this way, another time this way, another time this way. It'll all average out to the ring direction, but in short time scales in the algorithm, it allows you to meander and explore. So this parameter, this mini batch size, it allows you to, if you make it smaller, then you explore the decision space more. If you make it larger, you tend to head in consistent directions. And so there's a lot about this hyperparameter that is very much analogous to the number of parents in a GA. This hyperparameter, mini batch size, makes gradient descent more sensitive to small changes. So if you make it smaller, because it wiggles around a lot, it keeps changing. So even though the steepest direction is that way, it will go a little bit this way, a little bit this way, and it creates these meandering paths, and it makes it harder for it to get stuck in small traps. And that creates sort of a band that sort of filters out these small traps and allows you to get over them. And that helps correct for some of the biggest weaknesses of gradient descent, which we'll talk about here in comparison. And and that's very similar to how we talked about the number of parents in a genetic algorithm. As you make the number of parents closer to the population size, then you track very small changes. You're very sensitive changes in the fitness function. But as you make the number of parents smaller, so you open up the gap between the number of parents and the total population size, you create a band of insensitivity where even though there might be small variations in the fitness function, you kind of ignore them because you end up sort of selecting parents at random whose fitness is within that band. And that's kind of similar to what's going on here. So it's very different. The dynamical mechanisms to what's going on are very different, but the end effect can be very similar. So that is just as a background. As our character foil, as the thing we're sort of comparing against, this is, as a reminder of what we mean when we talk about stochastic gradient descent. Of course, you need the gradient to be able to do that. All right, any questions about that? So just a review for anybody who's taken a course on neural networks or basic machine learning. Okay, so we have this little table I set up here. And so what I'm trying to show here is that these three approaches, the genetic algorithm, evolution strategies, I'm going to focus on the variant matrix adaptation evolution strategy because it's sort of it works so well that it's sort of held up as our flagship evolution strategy, especially when you add restarts. So that kind of together is that, and then stochastic gradient descent, or SGD. So what I'm trying to do is to set up a comparison across these where we view them as not competitors, but complementary, used for different purposes, have different strengths and different weaknesses. And in real optimization problems, I think we're going to find if you've only ever used SGD, it might be because the optimization problems you've worked on have been very narrowly scoped. A lot has already been done for you. So if you've already trained a neural network, you might have said, well, I picked, my neural network is this particular convolutional neural net, and I am just training it or retraining it for my particular problem. Well, at that point, you've already fixed a lot of the structure of the problem. You've chosen the topology of the network already. You never ask, why was that topology the one I picked? You say, well, I read that it was a good one. Well, how did they figure out that that was a good one? So that's going to end up getting up to this side here. So as we're going to start seeing here, there's going to be a general trend where larger structural optimization will happen here on the left, and then more fine-grained fine-tuning, once you've fixed all the higher level structures, will happen here on the right. So the signal along those lines, the information-bearing signal that drives the dynamics of these differs significantly. So in the GA, it's the ranking of fitness. It's the absolute values of the optimization objective. And we don't consider any geometry. We don't even try to learn the geometry. We just say, based on raw fitness, I'm going to, I mentioned before, it's kind of hypothesis testing. I've got support for sticking around this value, but this value has such lower fitness that I've got to reject that hypothesis and not consider that anymore. So you're not considered the slope or anything like that. You're just sampling and trying to just use raw fitness to move through. That's where you get this information. In contrast, covariance matrix adaptation evolution strategies, or just evolution strategy, is focused more on the distribution statistics. So here you're actually looking at, based on my past successes and failures, am I learning something about the information geometry of the fitness function? So I'm not just focused on what's good right now, but I'm focused on when I was over here, the fitness was a little lower. Now that I've stepped over here, the fitness has got a little bit higher. But I noticed that this movement had a huge difference in fitness, but slight variations perpendicular to that did not. And so over time, you build a model of the underlying information geometry. And that information geometry drives your future sampling. So you're learning the geometry and then using the geometry to make your sampling more efficient in the future. So it is a learned geometry. And as we're going to see, it's very costly to learn that geometry. And that's where CMA-ES was meant to sort of approximate, or has now been shown that does approximate, these NES strategies, these natural gradient strategies, where the natural gradient is something you can use even when the gradient's not available. And even when the gradient's available, sometimes the natural gradient is the better thing to use because it's robust to parameterization. It doesn't matter how you set up your coordinate frames. It automatically rescales its step sizes. And that's going to be a major problem with gradient descent. The gradient descent doesn't do that, and that gets you into trouble if you don't have a really well-conditioned optimization objective. And then gradient descent, it gets all its information from the gradient. It doesn't learn a geometry. It has this fixed geometry that is you've provided it. Here is the gradient. Here is the curvature. Use it. All right, so that's information sources. Any questions there?
Yeah. So the geometry would still be unknown in this case, right? As in, like, the fitness landscape is still unknown. It's just that the way that's a bit confusing. Like, you still do not know the underlying geometry.
Well, with gradient descent, you assume you effectively do. You have a description a priori. Any point in the fitness landscape, you know the slope. Here, you don't know the slope. You have to do statistical sampling all around it to build a model of the slope and the curvature.
But that's like still a bit local, right? And just knowing the geometry in a large global sense, it's still not useful.
Well, you're not learning in the global sense, but you're not moving in the global. I mean, and you do have the ability to support more global, and that's what we'll get here when we get to scale. But you do have the ability to do more global searching here. But when we're talking movement, that's sort of a local question anyway. So locally, do I know if I'm on a hill or, in this way? So if I know that like if I need to make a choice about where to move, then it'd be useful to know whether that's uphill or that's down. So you're right that globally, I don't know that there's a peak way over there. So that's why none of these, even when you have fixed geometry, you can't be guaranteed it's going to converge to a global peak. And that's kind of one of the points here is that all of the strengths you get out of gradient descent are only very local strengths. Yeah. Questions about that? Yes. All right, so that's the information scale. And then what assumptions do we make? And that's, oh, I think I know. I think my eraser is configured to erase too much right now. Okay. All right, so the objective assumptions differ very much. In the GA, all you need to be able to do is to be able to evaluate the fitness function. So evaluability, that's the only assumption you have. And it doesn't have to be mathematical. It could be a simulation, it could be a real world experiment. It's just assumptions that if you propose an experiment, you can do the experiment and get numbers back from it. That is the only assumption you make. Contrast that with CMA-ES, you're assuming some local geometric coherence. So what we mean by that is if you sample enough, there will be statistical tendencies that you can depend upon. So if it's this idea here that I can learn an underlying shape, there is a response surface that can be fit to the data in a reliable way. And then you go even further with that. In stochastic gradient descent, you assume that a derivative is available. So you don't even have to sample. You just get the slope at any local position for free. So you gradually add more and more of these conditions as you go from left to right. Then your decision space, similarly, you get more and more constrained. In a GA, your decision space is pretty much anything you can think of. It can be discrete, doesn't even have to be ordered. It can be real. It can be a mixture of those two. And this is what's going to allow us today to talk about how we use the GA to write code. Because if your decision space as lines of code, I can't map that to a real number. But I need to map it to a real number if I want to use CMA-ES. Because CMA-ES assumes that I can make infinitesimal movements in any direction. So it assumes an underlying decision space of real numbers. And then gradient descent's even farther than that. Not only can I move in infinitesimal dimension or infinitesimal amounts, but everywhere I've got to have some notion of smoothness. So I have to have differentiability. So I can move in infinitesimal amounts and I'm not going to ever get like a step that I'm going to trip over. So, so that you get more and more constraints in terms of your decision space. So there's fewer problems you can solve with solutions on the right-hand side than you can solutions on the left-hand side. Questions so far? Go too fast. Okay, and then update scale. So similar to that, the GA is really focused on trying to be a global optimizer. You give it a diverse set of solutions, and although diversity will eventually be purged, it tries to use that diversity not to bring things closer together to exploit, but it tries to maintain as much as exploration as possible. So it is when we get into multimodal and multi-objective optimization, then we're going to find with very small modifications, we can, if in that problem that you're going to do, if you haven't already done for the mini project, there are multiple local optima. Well, the GAU build should find the global optima in that and be attracted to it. And the whole population, depending on, I guess, mutation parameters and other things you set, but basically is going to cluster around that point. And you might get a couple of stragglers, but they're probably going to be so low fitness, they'll be selected out unless you have really low selective pressure. But when we go to multimodal optimization, we make a tiny modification to the GA, and its population will distribute itself across all the local optima. So then when you get the local, the optima out, or when you get the population out at the end, you get a description not only of the best solution, but the second best solution, the third best solution, and so on. And so the GA is really designed to keep things large scale, try to find as much about the global space as possible. Whereas when we go to covariance matrix adaptation, it's really parametric. So we are assuming that we're in kind of we found a nearby area that we think we should be optimizing, and we want to then fit a local structure to that local area that helps us fine tune that to find the right parameters. And so it's going to adapt a simple model of local features in order to try to find the best settings of the parameters of that local area or of that model. So the parameters of that model. So it's trying to find the best parameters for a local response surface that fits a local region. So the scale is much narrower. And then it's very much so the same way in the stochastic gradient descent. Once it finds a peak, it just starts climbing that peak, and it's really focused on getting to the top of that peak, and that's making small incremental changes so that hopefully when it hits that peak, it stops at that peak and doesn't overshoot and ring around. And so it's really focused on finding that single point. So the scale gets, go from, I can't ask stochastic gradient descent to do a global optimization. It's just, I can run multiple gradient descents in parallel if I have diverse initial conditions. And maybe I'll get lucky and I'll start at them in exactly the right place for them to find local peaks. But they won't explore any. They really depend on me setting them up. So it's very local. Yeah.
So when you try to do that, right, how much of an assumption do you have to make about your search space, right? Like when you're trying to start with these multiple points and do the gradient descent using these multiple points, right? You need to have an efficient sampling strategy.
And that's really what these other things are for. So that's the idea, is that if all I had was stochastic gradient descent, but I know that I've got a complex space that has lots of possible good solutions, and I'd like to explore all of the possible good solutions, then I have to have somehow either been given a priori knowledge about how hilly this landscape is, or I need to use more larger scale optimizers to give me those neighborhoods. And then from those neighborhoods, I can then seed gradient descent in those neighborhoods to then explore or to exploit just those neighborhoods. So I have to gain that information somehow. And sometimes, in a neural network, even though you fix a lot of the structural properties, the loss functions are pretty ugly. If you were to aggregate, there are people who approximate loss functions of neural networks, and they have lots of local peaks and troughs and all these sorts of things. And that's the reason why you often have to add something to your objective function, so-called regularizer, which we'll talk more about when we get to PSO, which dents so your landscape has all these local peaks where you're going to have a decent neural network, and each one of this is a low loss, this is a low loss, and this is a low loss. So there's all these different weight combinations that give you similar low losses. And so you arbitrarily sort of dent the whole landscape so that, let's say, close to all the weights being zero, you just pull that down. And so now all these things that had these local loss functions that were locally similar, by pulling the whole sheet down, then now this envelope kind of pulls down and makes the ones that are kind of closer to the origin, closer to having your weights being equal to zero, the strongest candidates. And that will sort of force the neural network to converge upon these in a kind of an arbitrary way. And so, and that's really what SGD needs, because it needs a map. It at least you need to get it to the neighborhood. It'll search through the neighborhood for the right house. But otherwise, if you don't give it a zip code, if you don't give it a neighborhood, it has no idea how to search. And so you have to kind of know something about the map. And if you don't know something about the map, you either guess, in the case of these regularizers, or you warm start the SGD with one of these. Question?
How do you know you can move between CMA-ES and stochastic gradient descent, or prove that this thing is differentiable or continuous?
Well, so yeah, how do you it's differentiable is, if you've defined the loss function, you've written out the loss function. So you said in the case of a a neural network, we've said that the loss function is going to be the sum of the differences between, I mean, this is basically a little bit like a regression problem where it's the sum of the differences of the outputs, the expected output and the real output. And I just define my loss function as going to be my predicted output minus my real output. And, you know, that could be an absolute value. It could be, you could take a square of that. And, you know, if you add up all of those for each one of your training points, then you get this function. And then you can say this loss function that I just wrote, is it differentiable? And it just so happens that for neural networks, early days of neural networks, people were more willy-nilly about, you know, they were more creative about loss functions that they built. Nowadays, because the stochastic gradient descent with a few fixes is so efficient at optimizing neural networks that are differentiable, that there's a big push to make sure that you have differentiability when you build your loss functions. That might mean if you're doing a simulation optimization, can you rebuild your simulator to somehow be differentiable? Can you invent a notion of derivative for a simulation? So people are doing that, like finding new ways to add differentiability so that they can use these things. But generally speaking, if your fitness function is just an ugly function that you have no idea how to take the derivative of, you know, it's got a bunch of integrals in it, and it's transcendental functions and all sorts of things like that, where if you try to take the derivative in a multivariate space, you don't have a closed form derivative, then this is just off limits, unless you can find a region of the domain that you can restrict it to where maybe you can approximate it with some other loss function. Then you can use these. But so you just kind of have to explore, how did I build, what is my loss function or my fitness function? Do I actually think I have a derivative for this? And if this doesn't even make sense to find that derivative, then you can't go this far. You're stuck in CMA-ES or heuristics like the GA. So you just have to know about the function that you're optimizing. And a lot of times you design the function that you're optimizing. And can I manage to design differentiability into it? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. For a lot of simulation optimization, you can't. Any other questions about that? All right, so then our exploration space. So in the GA, we're using our exploration strategy, I guess, and maybe I should have said exploration strategy here, but is that I use population dynamics as my exploration strategy. I'm just gonna try that strategy instead. We already have scale. Okay. All right, so the strategy for exploration in the GA are population dynamics, natural selection, mutation, so on. That's what's driving changes. That's how we explore. In CMA-ES, it's adaptive sampling. So in this case, we update the parameters of a sampling distribution, and in the next generation, we take samples from that distribution. From those samples, interacting with a fitness function, we update the parameters again, and we do that over and over again. In stochastic gradient descent, we just use gradient noise. So that's that mini batch that I was talking about. So to get around some of the weaknesses, which are going to pop up down here in this bottom corner, then we add a little bit of directional noise to the gradient. And that hopefully, if you find one of these really ugly points that gradient followers will be attracted into and then get stuck in, trapped in, if you then perturb the gradient a little bit, then hopefully you can get around these point-wise issues and keep moving. And so that noise is the exploration. So there's very little exploration that goes on in gradient descent. You're mainly following, the gradient, and by calculating the gradient in a noisy way, you get a little bit of diffusion around that drift. So you're just changing the signal to noise ratio. So similar to how you're adding mutation in the population dynamics, here you're adding a little diffusion to the drift along the gradient. where I'm not using drift in the genetic sense, using drift in the mathematical sense. And then finally, the weaknesses. So in a GA, fine-tuning is very slow. So you crank your R up really high, and it's going to be very difficult for it to find a lot of peaks. And when it finds those peaks, it retains so many individuals. It takes a while to get rid of them, and but that allows you to fine-tune, but it's very slow. So many iterations, as opposed to CMA-ES, you can get premature collapse. So you can, if you do happen to find a local optima that isn't, like there's another one nearby, but you just happen to find that and it starts adapting its covariance matrix for that one, you can very quickly collapse to a point. So that covariance matrix will start changing its shape to fit the shape of that peak, and then it'll start contracting into a point, and that premature collapse is leads to you getting an apparently high confidence solution, but it missed the other ones nearby. So when you have a restart, when it stagnates, it can then restart, and a lot of times the restarts will then restart with a larger population size or a more diverse population. So it'll spread out a little bit more, and then hopefully it'll find anything nearby that it missed the first time around. But huge scaling cost. That covariance matrix is in dimensions of your decision space. So if you have 1,000-dimensional decision space, so like 1,000 degrees of freedom in this design problem, then you have to calculate a covariance matrix that is like 1,000 by 1,000. And you have to update that basically every iteration. So the per iteration cost for covariance matrix adaptation evolution strategy is very high because it has to learn. So that's the cost of the natural gradient. That's the cost of learning, is that when you're not provided a gradient, you define that natural gradient, then you have to put a lot more sampling effort. And on top of that, it turns out that the larger your decision space, there's a relationship in the hyperparameters for the population size. So if you have a large decision space, then you're going to roughly need a population size that is like roughly half of that. So you just have to do a lot of sampling in order to make CMA-ES really work, in order to make this fitting process work, to get this natural gradient. So that doesn't come for free. And then on the stochastic gradient descent, you get saddle trapping. So you can have saddle points where in one dimension, it might be reaching a minimum, but another dimension, it's a maximum. And this can be very confusing to a gradient follower to figure out the right gradient, where it's supposed to go. And then it's very sensitive to poor conditioning. So if you remember back to your linear algebra, the condition of a matrix is the ratio of the highest eigenvalue to the lowest eigenvalue. So even though it doesn't use the Hessian, we use the Hessian to talk about this, the second derivative. And that if the curvature of, if we model the curvature as its differential, as it's twice differentiable, then that second derivative, that Hessian, if it's poorly conditioned, which means you've got basically a really steep curvature in one dimension and maybe a really shallow curvature in another dimension. If that's the case, then you only have one step size, and that step size might change, but it's not adaptive at a dimensional scale. And so with these two different scales, like so in this dimension, you're going to want a small step size in order to find the bottom of it. But in this dimension, you're going to want a large step size in order to move efficiently across it. This is an example of poor conditioning of the optimization objective. And this can lead to sort of zigzagging because making progress in this here is going to cause you to potentially overshoot in this dimension. So you might end up getting a lot of zigzagging as you move down this slow dimension, as you keep responding to changes in feedback from the other dimension. It's kind of like you're trying to roll down a shallow hill, but you're in a groove, and that marble that is rolling down that hill, it keeps going up the walls. And so you end up getting this zigzagging up this steep wall, and then that steep wall creates a huge gradient, which then forces you back down and fast. So you end up getting a slow roll with very steep oscillations back and forth. And this is exactly the wrong case for stochastic gradient descent. And that's why for a long time, stochastic gradient descent just did not work. It was terrible for the applications we use it for today, until they added things like that you might have heard about, like momentum and so on. These things help mitigate some of these issues, but really the niche where stochastic gradient descent works is where all of the dimensions of your decision space have similar curvature. So you kind of want a bowl that sort of is similar this way as it is this way. So that marble can roll down the bowl and eventually come to rest at the center. And once you start getting grooves throughout that bowl, so high dimensional grooves and with low dimensional trends, then it's very hard for it to find the bottom of that bowl and stick there. And that's the beauty of the natural gradient. The natural gradient automatically rescales to make sure that the realized gradient has equal curvature in all dimensions. It's detecting that when I walk in this dimension, a small step size gives me the same amount of information as a large step size does in this direction. And it rescales so that the gradient that CMA-ES feels is like that nice smooth bowl after the rescaling. That's why we say that the natural gradient, or CMA-ES, is robust to reparameterization. That's what prevents this poor conditioning problem. SGD is stuck with, and as you change, if you happen to change your units on your weights that you're trying to optimize with SGD, it will change the dynamics of it because you're changing the gradient magnitudes. So it is not robust to reparameterization. So there's a lot of choices that seem arbitrary that you could make that will change the performance of gradient descent, but will not change the performance of CMA-ES. But CMA-ES per iteration is way costlier. This is like an order of D, and this is an order of D squared. So per iteration, this is the costliest because of how much it's doing. This GA per iteration is the cheapest, but it's so slow that it may require lots of iterations to get to a solution. Whereas gradient descent can get to a solution very fast because it uses that gradient as a map. But it has to start low.
So it's not necessarily a decreasing cost kind of a thing in this direction.
No, it's per iteration. I would say this is maybe the lowest, this is the highest, and this is in between. Per run of the algorithm, then still this can be very costly, but I would say maybe it's more like this, or maybe a little bit like this, where the cost per the whole algorithm goes up here. But I would say if your fitness function is not costly to compute, like if it's a mathematical function that's relatively fast, that's the biggest thing that you're paying with GAs, is that you're sampling from that fitness function. You're doing a lot of function evaluations. So if your function evaluations are cheap, then the GA is cheap. But if your function evaluations are expensive, well, usually if your function evaluations are expensive, you're probably in an area where you probably don't have a gradient that's available. But if you did magically have a gradient and your function was expensive, then it would be better to use this one if you can locally, because that gradient allows you to sample less. Yeah.
So for population dynamics, is the algorithms used in like predator-prey like populations over time? Is that like an example of a GA if you're like trying to design the perfect predator or something?
Well, I guess when I say population dynamics, I'll say mutation, natural selection, etc. And I guess I could say, instead of population dynamics, I could clarify that and say population genetics. So you're right that you can build predator-prey models, like how do these different populations, fit with each other, but those changes in population are assuming that changes in traits are not driven, you don't have to worry about the genetic architecture, you just have to worry about who's around. And population genetics really get down into trying to think about not the dynamics of what individuals are around, but what genetic strategies are around. And so so it's probably more, when I say population dynamics, it's probably too broad, and I should say population genetics, meaning the four forces, or I could just say evolution here, really. So the four first forces of evolution. Now, you can build optimization metaheuristics that are based off of these predator-prey models, and where it's like an adversarial thing where the predator maybe gets an edge if it finds a higher fitness, and the prey is somehow adds noise, or you can imagine there's some narrative you could set up that might end up kind of searching the space, but we don't think about predator-prey systems in any sense solving an optimization problem. They're just sort of coming into balance, where we sort of assume that evolution at least has some aspects of it that are moving up fitness landscapes. There's predator-prey models are just coming into equilibrium, they're not moving up landscapes, but evolution models, because of natural selection, are thought to be moving up fitness landscapes, which is why they are the main source of inspiration for a lot of algorithms.
Okay, so it's not really a genetic algorithm, the predator-prey one.
No, I would say that now there are people that couple predator-prey dynamics with population genetics, because then you can start talking about that how the traits change ecological feedbacks. So you can say these genes cause these expression of these traits provide this function. So they're sort of saying that we want to try to model where fitness comes from. And so we can try to model that these genes give this predator an advantage in finding these prey, but that these prey, those who have the genes that evolve ways of being cryptic to the predators, will then get an advantage. So you can push traditional predator-prey models down a level and say, let's also model how traits evolve in the subpopulations, and then couple those two systems together, and people do that. But that's now getting more into just pure biology than bio-inspired optimization. Any other questions about this grid? All right, there's also some examples that might help with this, and then I like to get to the codes. So if you take that grid, then we're going to sort of say, all right, so then what are some examples of systems where, I'm going to use the same four systems, but I'm going to use these three algorithms for different aspects of those systems. So as an example, I've already mentioned this one for a neural network, coming up with the topology, the architecture, which layers to freeze. So in a neural network, if it's a multi-layered feed-forward network, you might find out that you only want to optimize one layer, and the rest you just randomize and leave them so-called frozen. So which layers do you want to adapt, and which layers do you need to leave frozen? So in a large language model, it's pre-trained, everything's frozen, but now you can bolt onto the side of it this thing called a low-rank adaptation, and you can train a large language model just by training this little adapter that's on the side, and you leave everything else frozen. So, deciding the structure of that adapter, those are things that are outside of the realm of down here, but are things that are easier to investigate with a GA because they're discrete. And they're more global. Loss functions, which loss functions to use. That's another thing that you could put in the GA. For a robot control design, the structure of the gate. So, how many legs do you have? And if you're using an oscillator to drive this pattern of walking, then how simple is that oscillator? Do you is it just sort of one, left foot, right foot, and then I repeat? Or is it left foot, right foot, a different left foot, a different right foot, and then repeat? That gate structure is something that you can experiment with the GA, but because it's so discrete, it's not this nice, smooth, continuous search, it'd be difficult to use these here. Which sensors to use in which part of a robot? If there's a state machine that's driving decisions that are going on in the robot, what's the structure of that state machine? Those are all things good for a GA. As kind of a cutesy example, your own dental hygiene. Do I use floss or toothpaste or mouthwash? And which is an electric toothbrush or a static toothbrush? And I mentioned multimodal optimization, and maybe you find that in every good solution you can come up with, there's always floss. Floss is just so important because plaque hardens to tartar in 24 to 48 hours. It hides between your teeth. If you don't manage to get it off In 24 to 48 hours, it becomes cement and you're stuck with it and it eats away at your gums. So floss is a necessity. But the rest of those, you have a lot more flexibility. So the GA might show you that in every good solution I can find, there's always floss. But so it explores all of those solutions. Airfoil design optimization. How do you represent the airfoil? What are the number of control points on the airfoil? And the number of, so again, very discrete, global optimizers. If we go down to CMA-ES with restarts, then now we can sort of think of, well, for a neural network, the CMA-ES can be a hyper-heuristic for the hyperparameters of gradient descent. So in gradient descent, you have to make some choices about step sizes, about regularization parameters, and so on. How do you make those? Well, maybe CMA-ES does that for you. Those are smooth parameters that it can explore. Mini batch size, it's another one of these hyperparameters. So maybe CMA-ES figures out the right mini batch size for your gradient descent. For the robot, feedback gains, oscillator parameters. So again, these continuous control parameters that might exist in qualitatively different regions of the space. So you have PID gains that are high proportional. You have PID gains that are high integrator. You have PID gains that are high derivative. You can make all three of them work. Maybe they have different energy profiles, but they all three are stable. So figuring out which ones of those to use, maybe that's something that CMA-ES can help you with. The dental thing, approximate how long you should brush, how much pressure to apply. These different timing intervals for these things, for how long to floss and things like that. Airfoil, again, shape parameters, again, everything, these all have to be continuous. The thickness distribution of the airfoil, that is something that can be perturbed continuously. So it might be good for CMA-ES. After you get a rough structure of these solutions, then you can fine tune them with things that are in the family of gradient descent. And so for an ANN, you finally have fixed the network structure, you decided which weights to train, and you've decided the structure of the loss function. So you give all that to the gradient descent, and it takes that gradient and it fine tunes, and it finds exactly where the best weights are given everything that's already been set up for it over here. A lot of that has already been done for people when they just get an off-the-shelf neural network out of a paper and then retrain it for their particular problem set. And a robot, again, so if now your controller, your plant is differentiable, then now you might, instead of tuning your feedback gains up here, maybe you can actually tune them down here. So a lot of times you might be controlling a system that you can't take a derivative. You can't say, what is the impact of changing this proportional gain on my output, because I'm controlling a plant that that I don't have a model for, or it's got a really ugly nonlinear model and I can't take the derivative through it. But if I can, then maybe I can actually optimize those PID gains by taking a partial derivative and seeing where it's equal to zero, the gradient descent. Fine-tuning those approximate durations and then fine-tuning those approximate parameters. So going from large-scale discrete to fine-scale continuous, when you can count on derivative information and when you can't. Questions on those? These are complementary tools. As you get to more sophisticated AI types of data, it used to be deep learning before large language models. Deep learning used to be bundling these things all together. So you would have higher level processes that would choose the lower level processes. Like there'd be statistical decision models, like whether you're going to do random forest regression or whatever else. There'd be higher level models that choose among the lower level stats models, and then you optimize the lower level stats models. And this was part of the deep, was not just how many layers was in your neural network, was how many layers was in this structure. Things have changed a little bit since then, but still you find that there's a lot of problems where even if these aren't bolted together in one pipeline, a human starts out here, gets a general idea of what a solution looks like, and then builds specialized versions of that solution and then moves down to these. Yeah.
But this is more like the GAs would be on a meta level, right? And the CME-ES would be on a meta level because it's optimizing for the hyperheuristics, let's say. So you would need to have the first stochastic descent based, like whatever rate model in place. And then on top of that, you would be optimizing using the GAs for the structure.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can think about, you've got the SGD in the bottom and you're building on top of it. Or you can think of the order going in the other direction, where I start with, I have no idea what a solution might look like. And the GA searches over a huge number of, then once I see what a solution might look like, then I come up with a specialized version of that that's appropriate for application here. So I think sometimes people already kind of know what things look like here's my neural network. But for this particular training data, when I combine it with this neural network, I need to revise the hyperparameters for the SGD optimizer, Atom, or whatever you're using. And so then they maybe kick it up and say, all right, I need to retune these hyperparameters. But that's when you kind of already know what the neural network basically looks like. There's a lot of other problems where you just have no idea what a solution looks like. And so you have to start up here and then go down. Yeah.
So something like grid search algorithm would be a CMA-ES.
Well, so CMA-ES is very specific to how it approximates, how it generates this information geometry over time. But a grid search definitely fits in a family of optimization meta-heuristics, which could be kind of in competition with this level. So as we talk about, we're going to talk about simulated annealing, where that we actually get rid of a population and we focus again on one searcher, and that's going to feel a lot more like that. All right, well, let's move on, but marinate, let that marinate a little bit. But hopefully, I know there's some questions at the end of the last class I was here about, given that stochastic gradient descent works so well for many familiar problems, why are we even spending this much time on these other optimizers? Because isn't gradient descent, hasn't that emerged as champion? And I just want to say it's a champion for its niche, but that's a really tiny niche. But that niche is a powerful niche because people have realized how good gradient descent is in that niche, and they figured out how to squeeze so many of human problems into that niche. And so they've created neural networks that can do so much more in order to fit into there. You can argue that a large language model, now that we have this so-called in-context learning, pre-trained frozen models that seem to learn after training, they're gigantic, they use huge amounts of energy, but they fit in this niche. They are easy to train, they just require a lot of resources to do it. And so it's like humanity has been spending eons figuring out how to take all of the world's problems to fit into this niche where we know how to solve it. But there's probably better solutions if you're willing to use more sophisticated methods to find them. But for now, this one works so well, so we've got these really forced solutions like these large language models that are really impressive, but they require so many parameters, so much training data, so much energy to train, because they're kind of contrived. Because they're trying to say, how do we make something that is trained by gradient descent as powerful as something that evolution has put together? And evolution does not require gradient descent. And so it's been able to find a lot more creative solutions. SGD is not about being creative, it's about fine-tuning. So how do we find the right structures that we can fine-tune to get really great stuff out? And that's how we got large language models. But that's why a lot of the old school, like the really crusty faculty, are really like, oh, these aren't real AI, they're not reasoning. You're like, well, when they do your homework, it seems like they do. So it's a perspective about whether we're making progress or not. But the structure of these models, the reason why we have these big, ugly monstrosities are because of the success of gradient descent and the narrow scope for which it is successful. So in order to make a model work with gradient descent, you got to do a lot of work in making it gigantic, and then you can allow gradient descent to do its work. But there probably are better models, but they require other methods to find. Okay, so pivoting off of that, the GA is, like I said, low cost per iteration, and theoretically can be used for many problems. So one of the questions is, can it write software? So I know nowadays we've got large language models that can write software for you because they've been pre-trained with these patterns, and that's fine. But in the 1960s, before these models were around, then people were interested in whether you could generate code just by using these evolutionary approaches. And what's interesting is some of their first applications were building language models, code for language models. So it's sort of ironic that now we have language models that write code, and but in some of the earliest applications of evolutionary programming, we're using non-language models to write language models. So let's see how that worked. So one of the first examples, and this actually predates the GA, is evolutionary programming, Lawrence Fogel in the 60s. So it's remarkably similar to genetic algorithms. So a lot of times I just present them as if they're contemporaries or that this came later. But it's really kind of convergent evolution, so to speak, in that evolutionary programming is very similar to the GA in structure. But this version used discrete mutation. So and that's how it was used with programming languages, because you're choosing mutating a symbol. So how do you mutate a symbol? That's a discrete mutation. And it would do it on finite state machines, which we'll talk about here in a second. And so it was evolving state machines. And that was an attempt to make computers write solutions to problems. Later versions, because we're going to see that evolutionary programming gets displaced by genetic programming just was much better at it. Interestingly enough, those who were working on evolutionary programming then turned evolutionary programming to optimization. And in the 90s, the evolutionary programming became an optimizer that looked almost identical to evolution strategies, but using tournament selection. So again, a lot of interesting convergent evolution and competitors, but CMA-ES kind of won that. So now we have genetic algorithms, genetic programming, and CMA-ES. We don't really talk about these kind of historical ones here, but just setting them up to provide us some foundations. All right, so the original evolutionary programming, you can think of it as like GA without crossover. That's important because if you want to do crossover, the simplest way to do crossover, like nature does, is to make sure your genotype is a string. Because then you can lay the strings next to each other, pick a point, and cross over. If you don't depend on crossover, you can use genotypes organized as a bag of, anything. They don't have to have structure because they don't have to swap at any particular point. They don't have to agree on where, points are. So rather than thinking this as, so it's more like the model here is interspecies competition without hybridization. So it's like you create different species of state machines, and they have little mutations within their species. And these species are competing for the same niche. And that niche is the solution to your particular programming problem. It's kind of the model that you can think about here. So like I said, the genotype encodes a finite state machine. We're going to review what that looks like here in a second. And it uses discrete mutation to generate new finite state machines. And then tournament selection among those state machines. Now we all know what tournament selection is, so we can leverage that. And the tournament selection competes the combination of parents and their offspring. So every parent has one mutated offspring. So it's like an M plus M evolution strategy. So you get a population of 2 M, so M parents and M offspring. You do tournament selection to create the new population of M parents and repeat. So what does that look like? So as an example, so here's a problem that you want the evolutionary programming optimizer, if you want to call it that, to solve. And the idea here is basically a natural language processing task where we've got a sequence of symbols from the environment as our input. And we've got a desired prediction of next symbol. So we've got a sentence. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy, and then what's the symbol that comes next? And so we've got sequences from the input, predictions of next symbols on the output, and then it will then make a prediction and then calculate a loss. So it calculates and accuracy of that prediction. How often, so if I give it 100 test samples, how often does it predict the next word correctly? So this, as a reminder, it's going to evolve a finite state machine, and all computer programs can be viewed as finite state machines. So every finite state machine you can write as a computer program, every computer program you can write as a finite state machine. So evolving finite state machines is equivalent to evolving software. So as a reminder to, or maybe, a reintroduction, but this is, finite state machine is a combination of states and transitions that are triggered by changes in input and outputs that are either tied to transitions or, in this case, tied to states. So this idea here is that there's a bunch of these latent states inside the program. And in this case, you start out, so the double circle in state A, and while you're in state A, you have output A. And when you're in state A, there are certain inputs that will leave you in state A. And when you're in state A, there are certain inputs that will take you to another state, state B, where the output will change. Now, these outputs could be null, might not decide to output, or they could be something, but you can still encode a null output as an output. When you're in state D, you either get an input that takes you to some other state, or you get an input that takes you back to state A, or you might have an input that just has you stay in state B. So that's our simple overview of a finite state machine. So we're evolving populations of these things. So each parent generates one mutated finite state machine based on itself. And then we have tournament selection among the combination of parents and offspring to figure out who the new parents will be. So randomly draw, it's got a hyperparameter for how big the tournaments are, just like we've seen in the GAA. Now, how do you generate the next offspring? Well, we use a discrete mutation where multiple times, potentially, you can do one of these things. You can change an output symbol, so you can change these things here. You can change a state transition, so you can say that state A is now going to have a transition to state Z over here that wasn't there before. You can get rid of a state transition. You can get rid of that one as well. You can add a new state, so I can introduce state Z. I can remove an old state and all transitions to and from it, and then I can change the initial state. So instead of getting a double circle here, I get a double circle here. So with these 5 operations where I can do one at a time, I can just randomly select from these 5 options and just generate new mutant state machines based on the parent state machine. That will give me offspring state machines that I can then run with my input symbols and then see if they do a better job at predicting the output. So natural language programming with state machines, a fun thing. That's basically evolutionary programming. Questions about that? So the key thing is, because we have no crossover, we don't have to build a crossover operator that figures out how to crossover between these things. Because how would you cross a state machine that had 2 states with a state machine that had 200 states? Where is the crossover? So we get rid of crossover, it allows us to use state machines. Then we just have to come up with a mutation operator. Kind of a reasonable mutation operator, it's just a discrete mutation. So, and then it's just basically a normal GA. The ordering is a little different than the conventional one, but you could still, you might have to change the order a little bit, maybe change how the selection's done, but you could evolve with a normal GA if you found a way to encode these with a modern GA. Just turn off crossover and you could re-implement this with a modern GA. Any questions about that? Before we pivot to now genetic programming, which is kind of the dominant paradigm for this sort of evolutionary computing. Okay, so like I said, that evolutionary programming gets rid of crossover, and that's the big way that it works. But crossover is a powerful thing. We know that crossover helps us with the GA. So it seems like it would be great if we found a way that we could introduce crossover to programming. So how do we do that? Approach one is so-called linear genetic programming. So the idea here is that we are going to go back to forcing our genotype to be a string. And that works really well for computer programs because computer programs are strings of instructions. So already it seems like we're in the ballpark. The problem here is that how do you make crossover work with a string of instructions? We need to exclude certain things, certain types of programming languages. So the one thing, the kind of the biggest thing is that we cannot have multi-line blocks, no begin and end symbols. Because if you did a crossover and begin was on one side of the crossover point and end was on the other side of the crossover point, then the two offspring would generate syntax errors. Because you'd get a begin and one offspring and it'd be like, where's the end? Because it swapped in something that didn't have an end from the other parent. And then likewise, in the other offspring, it had an end in the bottom with no begin. So you can't have these multi-line blocks. It's also convenient, though not killer, if it's not a symbolic language. So if you introduce symbol names like X, Y, Z, A, B, and C, and then use them, then a problem might be that you might cross over references to symbols that have not been declared yet. Now, if you're in a language where if you reference a symbol that hasn't been declared, you do lazy initialization of that symbol to some default value, then you're okay. But it's still not great. So fortunately, most assembly languages meet these criteria. Assembly languages use registers, hardware registers, instead of variables. So you don't say X equals 5. You say, hey, you've got 10 registers. I'm going to assign 5 to register 1. And register 1, it's almost like the registers are global variables that are just always available to you. Because they're global variables, then you don't have to worry about them being in scope. The other nice thing about assembly language is there's no blocks. Everything just jumps. You jump from line number to line number. So if you move a jump from one area, from one genotype to another during crossover, that's fine. As long as you're jumping to a number that exists within the program counter, then you're fine. So a nice example of this, but certainly not the only way you can do this. Really, again, any assembly language can work for these linear genetic programs. But I like this one because it really looks so much more kind of biological, is the one instruction set computer. And there are a variety of OISCs, one instruction set computers. The kind of most popular one I would say is SBN, subtract and branch of negative. So imagine an assembly language where it had one instruction, subtract and branch of negative. And this is what the instruction looks like. So if you have SBN A, B, C, where A and B are registers and C is a program counter number, a line of code, then what this will do is it will say, the contents of register A will be the contents of register A minus the contents of register B. And if the result is negative, then I'm going to jump to whatever C is. Otherwise, I just go to the next line. Subtract and branch of negative. It turns out that that's Turing complete. Every single thing you can write in a computer program, you can write with SBN. Here's an example of that. Let's say I wanted to do set A equal to B. We're in a symbolic language. I've got a variable A, I've got something already existing in B, and I just want to copy B into A. Well, the way I do that in SBN is I say in line 0, so I've got line numbers here. I do SBN 331. So I've got a machine that's got at least 3 registers. So what I'm saying here is by doing 3, I'm saying take the contents of register 3 and set it equal to the contents of register 3 minus the contents of register 3. That just sets the contents of register 3 equal to 0. It clears register 3. After I do that, then I do SBN 322. So that's going to take the contents of register 3, which is 0, and subtract the contents of register 2. So now register 3 stores the negation of register 2. And then regardless of whether that's negative or positive, it goes to the next line. And then I go to the next line, I take the contents of register 1, and I subtract from those contents the contents of register 1, clearing register 1, and then finally, I take that zeroed register 1, subtract the contents of register 3, which was the negation of register 2, which effectively copies the contents of registers 2 into the contents of register 1. So now, whatever was in 2 is now also in 1. That is SVN for setting A equal to B. Looks crazy, but this looks very genotype, right? It's basically, I could get rid of SVN and I'd basically get 331, 322, 113, 134. This here, I mean, would be easy for me to encode. You know, this is my gene. Like, you know, I basically have genes that are 3 sets of numbers, and the alleles are the different numbers that go into those different positions. And if I can mutate these, I can cross over with these, and I can then execute the resulting code that comes from creating individuals of these. They can become longer, they can become shorter, and that's how I can use linear genetic programming to write software. I just have to come up with a fitness function and just say, what do I want this software to do? It might be I have 1,000 unit tests. And so, you know, this unit test, if I give it an input of this, it should have this output, and so on. And I just see how many of those unit tests it succeed on, and that becomes my fitness function. And then I create populations of these things, and I find the individuals that do the best on the unit tests. Question?
Sometimes the fitness function won't evaluate, right? If you somehow made like an infinite loop from going 0 to 1 to 0.
Well, so there is the completion problem. And so you might have to set some criteria that if it runs for, you know, like there'd be a certain termination condition where you're going to kind of detect that it is unlikely to terminate, or it's not terminating that amount of time, and then you give that like negative infinity fitness or something like that. But yeah, so you have to deal with those cases for sure. Questions about this? So there's a couple other things, and then we'll pause and we'll probably do the syntax trees. We'll start on Tuesday, and which will be good because we can slot them in very quickly and then go to immunocomputing, which will not take the whole period. So one of the cool things here is that, so a string of LGB compatible instructions can be mutated and crossed over without risk of syntax errors. And one of the things that's been kind of discovered, which maybe actually, I mean, now people know a lot more about these things called introns in biology, but when this was discovered, people still didn't quite know exactly what these introns were. So it turns out that in biological chromosomes, then there are coding regions. So those are regions that have genes that have alleles. And so every allele has got a start codon and a stop codon. So you can tell that in this gene, this is the stuff that actually gets turned into protein. It's actually coded. But then there's a bunch of other things that are in between those that don't have start codons and stop codons. So they're never actually used, they're never actually turned into proteins. But they're there. And now we're finding out in biology they actually do lots of other things. But it turns out that you can get equivalent of that in linear genetic programming. You can get strings of no-ops, basically. So you can get a block of code where the top line of the code is jump across them. And anything in between is just not realized. It's just junk code that doesn't have, it's because you jumped over it. As long as that jump stays there, then anything in between, you can mutate all you want, and it's not actually going to have any effect on fitness. And what people have found is that when you have linear genetic programming with lots of introns, lots of junk between the things that are actually executable or executable, then it speeds up convergence on program solutions. So these become little laboratories that are carried along in the genotype that allow for things to mutate, and then suddenly you get a mutation that turns off that jump statement. And now all that code that has been mutating on its own and not having any impact on fitness starts running. And that allows for jumps in fitness because you suddenly get a totally new function that a single point mutation wouldn't have been able to give you before. So it allows for you to accumulate mutations quietly and then try them all out at once. And a lot of times I'll have zero fitness, but many times it'll have evolved something that is usable. It brings you maybe closer to a solution. So if you have tight, compact, exon-only LGPs, then every change can break the fitness, because every change can break a function. And so you can't really experiment. But if you've got functional code with non-functional blocks that just aren't executed, that's where you can accumulate mutations over time and then try them out all at once. And it speeds up convergence significantly. And that kind of might speak to what's going on in biological systems. All right, let's stop there. So we'll see you on Tuesday. We'll finish this up and then talk about immunocomputing. So have a nice weekend. If you have any questions, feel free to come on.